Welcome to the Sleepy Stoic. Tonight, we turn our attention to a figure who stands in the shadows of Stoic history, yet whose influence extends through the centuries like roots beneath ancient stone. We speak of Musonius Rufus, a teacher whose name may be less familiar than those of his philosophical descendants, but whose wisdom shaped the very foundation of practical Stoicism as we understand it today. There is something fitting, perhaps, in the relative obscurity of Musonius Rufus. For here was a man who taught that philosophy must be lived rather than merely discussed, that the true measure of wisdom lies not in eloquent speeches or written treatises, but in the quiet dignity of daily conduct. He sought no fame, composed no elaborate philosophical systems, and left behind no complete works of his own hand. Yet his student Epictetus would become one of the most influential voices in Stoic thought, and through Epictetus, the teachings of Musonius would reach Marcus Aurelius himself, emperor and philosopher. We might think of Musonius Rufus as the Roman Socrates, not merely because of his method of teaching through dialogue and example, but because of his unwavering commitment to the notion that philosophy is a way of being in the world. Like Socrates before him, Musonius believed that the unexamined life was not worth living, but he went further, insisting that the examined life must also be the practiced life, the tested life, the life refined through deliberate hardship and continuous effort. In the first century of the Common Era, Rome stood at the height of its power and complexity. Wealth flowed through the empire like water through aqueducts, bringing with it luxury, decadence, and a certain spiritual confusion. Philosophy had become, for many, an ornament of education, a subject for sophisticated dinner conversation, a means of displaying cultural refinement. Against this backdrop, Musonius Rufus emerged as a voice calling for something radically different. Philosophy as training, as discipline, as the deliberate cultivation of character through action. His life spanned a tumultuous period in Roman history. Born around the year 25, Musonius came of age during the reign of Claudius and lived through the tyranny of Nero, the chaos of the year of 4 emperors, and into the more stable rule of the Flavian dynasty. Twice he suffered exile, banished for his philosophical views and his willingness to speak truth to power. Yet these exiles, rather than breaking him, became demonstrations of his teachings. He showed through his own endurance that hardship could be met with equanimity, that external circumstances held no power over the inner fortress of a well-trained mind. What we know of Musonius comes primarily through the accounts of his students and the fragments of his teachings preserved by later writers. His student Lucius compiled discourses and remembered conversations, preserving for us glimpses of a teaching style that emphasized direct engagement with life's practical challenges. These fragments reveal a mind concerned not with abstract metaphysics but with concrete questions. How should we eat? What kind of shelter do we truly need? How should we train our bodies? What is the purpose of marriage? How should we educate our children? These questions might seem mundane, yet within them lies profound philosophical territory. For Musonius understood that philosophy, if it is to be anything more than intellectual entertainment, must address the actual texture of human existence. We do not live in the realm of pure ideas. We wake in the morning and must decide what to eat for breakfast. We encounter other people and must choose how to speak and act. We face discomfort, temptation, loss, and change. These are not distractions from philosophy. These are the very arena in which philosophy proves its worth. Consider for a moment the conventional view of the philosopher in Musonius's time. Here was the figure draped in scholarly robes, surrounded by scrolls, debating fine points of logic in the comfort of well-appointed schools. The philosopher knew Plato and Aristotle, could discourse on the nature of virtue, understood the intricacies of Stoic physics and Stoic logic. All of this knowledge, Musonius suggested, meant nothing if it did not transform the knower. He would say that someone who has studied medicine but cannot heal is no true physician. The person who has read treatises on music but cannot play an instrument is no musician. Why then, he asked, should we consider someone a philosopher merely because they have memorized philosophical doctrines? The true philosopher is recognized not by what they can recite, but by how they live. Philosophy, in his understanding, is a craft, a technique, that must be practiced until it becomes second nature. This emphasis on practice over theory set Musonius apart from many of his contemporaries. While other teachers spent their time parsing the finer points of logical syllogisms or debating metaphysical propositions, Musonius directed his students toward self-examination and behavioral change. He believed that most people already knew, at least in principle, what virtue required. The problem was not lack of knowledge but lack of training. We know we should be patient, yet we lose our temper. We know we should be moderate, yet we indulge excessively. The gap between knowing and doing, this was the chasm that Musonius sought to bridge. His method involved what we might call philosophical athletics. Just as an athlete trains the body through repeated exercises, gradually building strength and skill, so the student of philosophy must train the soul. This training takes two forms, Musonius taught: training in thought and training in action. We must practice thinking correctly about what truly matters, distinguishing between what is up to us and what is not, between what is truly good and what merely appears attractive. But we must also practice acting in accordance with these correct thoughts, putting ourselves in situations that test and strengthen our philosophical convictions. The image that emerges from the fragments of Musonius's teaching is of a man intensely focused on the practical application of Stoic principles. He did not soften the demands of philosophy to make them more palatable. Rather, he insisted that the philosophical life requires genuine effort, real sacrifice, and continuous vigilance. Yet this rigor was not harsh or punitive in spirit. Musonius understood that human beings are capable of far more than they typically demand of themselves, and he saw his role as awakening this dormant potential. There is something deeply appealing in Musonius's approach, especially to our modern sensibilities. We live in an age saturated with information, drowning in advice, overwhelmed by options. We have access to more philosophical wisdom than any previous generation, yet we often feel no wiser for it. We read books on virtue, listen to podcasts about meaning, scroll through inspirational quotes, yet our lives may remain fundamentally unchanged. Musonius would not be surprised by this predicament. He would say that we are making the same mistake the Romans made, confusing the accumulation of knowledge with the transformation of character. To understand Musonius properly, we must situate him within the broader landscape of Stoic thought. Stoicism, by his time, had already existed for several centuries. Founded in Athens by Zeno of Citium around 300 years before the Common Era, Stoicism had developed a comprehensive philosophical system encompassing logic, physics, and ethics. The Stoics taught that the universe operates according to rational principles, that human beings possess a fragment of divine reason, and that virtue, defined as living in accordance with nature and reason, constitutes the sole genuine good. Early Stoicism devoted considerable attention to technical philosophical questions. The students of Chrysippus, the third head of the Stoic school, were known for their intricate logical arguments and their detailed theories about the physical structure of the cosmos. This theoretical sophistication gave Stoicism intellectual respectability and distinguished it from more purely practical philosophies. Yet by the time Stoicism reached Rome, a shift had begun. Roman temperament, more practical than Greek, more concerned with action than speculation, demanded a philosophy that could guide conduct in the complex world of politics, warfare, and social obligation. The earlier Roman Stoics, figures like Punitius and Posidonius, had already begun adapting Greek Stoicism to Roman sensibilities, softening some of its more paradoxical claims and emphasizing its ethical applications. Musonius continued and deepened this practical turn. He stripped away much of the technical apparatus of early Stoicism, focusing almost entirely on ethics, on the question of how one ought to live. This was not because he rejected Stoic logic or physics. Rather, he saw these as foundations that, once accepted, should lead directly to the transformation of life. In Musonius's teaching, we find the essence of what would later be called Roman Stoicism distilled to its core principles. The fundamental insight is this: we have control over our judgments, our intentions, and our responses, but not over external events. Most of what we worry about, desire, or fear lies outside our control. Reputation, wealth, health, the opinions of others, even life itself belong to the category of what the Stoics called indifference, things neither good nor bad in themselves. The only true good is virtue, excellence of character expressed through wisdom, justice, courage, and moderation. The only true evil is vice, the corruption of character through foolishness, injustice, cowardice, and excess. This may sound abstract, but Musonius always brought it back to concrete application. Consider wealth. Most people organize their entire lives around acquiring and preserving wealth, yet wealth lies completely outside our control. It can be lost through factors beyond our power: theft, fire, economic collapse, political upheaval. If we place our happiness in wealth, we make ourselves hostage to fortune. The wise person, Musonius taught, seeks instead to develop qualities that cannot be taken away: integrity, kindness, courage, self-discipline. But recognizing these principles intellectually accomplishes little unless we train ourselves to live by them. This is where Musonius's emphasis on practice becomes crucial. He recommended specific exercises, deliberate practices that would gradually reshape our habitual patterns of thought and action. Some of these practices involved embracing voluntary hardship, eating simple food, wearing plain clothing, sleeping on a hard bed, enduring cold and heat. The purpose was not ascetic self-punishment, but practical training. If we voluntarily experience discomfort when we need not, we prepare ourselves for the involuntary hardships that life inevitably brings. Imagine training for a marathon by running only on perfect days on flat terrain with ideal conditions. When the actual race arrives with its hills, weather, and unpredictable challenges, we would be unprepared. Musonius saw life itself as such a marathon, full of difficulties that cannot be avoided. Voluntary training in hardship prepares the soul to meet these difficulties with strength rather than collapse into complaint and despair. The person who has learned to sleep well on a simple mat will not be devastated if circumstances require rough accommodations. The one who has trained themselves to eat plain food will not suffer if elaborate meals become unavailable. This principle of training through voluntary hardship extended to all areas of life. Musonius advised his students to practice silence when they wished to speak, to practice restraint when they desired indulgence, to practice patience when they felt irritation rising. Each of these small practices was like a repetition in the gymnasium of the soul. Individually, they might seem insignificant, but accumulated over time, they transformed the practitioner's fundamental character. We should pause here and reflect on what kind of teacher Musonius must have been. The fragments of his teachings that survive suggest a person of remarkable consistency between doctrine and life. When he was exiled to the barren island of Gyra, a place considered so harsh that it was reserved for the worst criminals, Musonius did not despair or complain. Instead, he demonstrated in his own person the teachings he had offered his students. He showed that exile could not touch his inner freedom, that deprivation could not diminish his tranquility, that political powerlessness could not compromise his dignity. This living example proved more powerful than any argument. His students, observing their teacher's equanimity in the face of hardship, could not dismiss his teachings as mere theory. They saw philosophy embodied, made flesh, tested by actual adversity. This is perhaps why Epictetus, who studied with Musonius during his youth, would himself become such a profound teacher. He had witnessed firsthand what philosophy looked like when fully lived. The relationship between teacher and student held special significance for Musonius. He did not view education as the transfer of information from one mind to another, as if knowledge were a commodity that could be packaged and delivered. Rather, he saw teaching as a relationship of transformation. The teacher's role was to provoke self-examination, to challenge comfortable assumptions, to model the philosophical life, and to provide guidance as the student struggled to change ingrained habits. This required the teacher to know the student as an individual, to understand their particular weaknesses and strengths, their specific obstacles to progress. We can imagine the scene. Small groups gathered around Musonius, not in grand lecture halls but in modest settings, perhaps even in his own simple dwelling. The atmosphere would not have been one of formal academic instruction but of genuine philosophical dialogue. A student raises a question about anger, perhaps, or speaks about anxiety regarding business matters. Musonius does not respond with abstract theory. Instead, he probes deeper. Why does this situation trouble you? What judgment are you making about it? What do you truly control here? What are you imagining would be so terrible if the feared outcome occurred? What would the virtuous person do in this circumstance? Through such questioning, Musonius guided his students to examine their own minds, to uncover the false beliefs generating their distress, to recognize the difference between their judgments and external facts. He helped them see that they were disturbing themselves through their own interpretations and that by changing those interpretations, they could restore their tranquility. But he did not stop with intellectual insight. He pressed them toward practice. What will you do differently tomorrow? How will you prepare yourself for the next challenging situation? What exercise will you undertake to strengthen this virtue? This combination of philosophical insight and practical discipline characterized Musonius's entire approach. He trusted that human beings possess the capacity for self-improvement, but he knew that this capacity remained dormant without exercise. We might compare it to physical fitness. Everyone has muscles, but muscles atrophy without use and strengthen only through regular exertion. Similarly, everyone possesses the seed of virtue, a natural human capacity for reason and goodness, but this capacity must be deliberately cultivated through philosophical practice. Musonius held distinctive views on several topics that set him apart even from other Stoics. He argued, controversially for his time, that women had the same capacity for philosophy as men and should receive the same philosophical education. Since virtue is the only true good and women can develop virtue just as men can, there is no reason to exclude them from philosophical training. He spoke of marriage as a partnership founded on mutual philosophical development, where both partners support each other's growth in virtue. These views, though still limited by the horizons of his time, showed a willingness to follow philosophical principles to their logical conclusions regardless of conventional prejudices. On the subject of food, Musonius taught that we should eat for nourishment rather than pleasure, choosing simple, natural foods that sustain health without inflaming desire. This was not merely dietary advice but philosophical practice. Each meal presented an opportunity to exercise self-control, to distinguish between genuine need and mere appetite, to choose the virtuous path rather than the path of least resistance. The person who cannot govern their eating, Musonius suggested, will struggle to govern more consequential aspects of life. Small disciplines prepare us for larger ones. Similarly, with regard to housing and possessions, Musonius advocated simplicity. We need shelter, certainly, but we do not need luxury. The elaborate homes of the wealthy, with their marble imported from distant quarries, their rare woods, their costly decorations, these represent not genuine need but vanity and the desire to impress others. The philosophical student should live simply, not out of poverty but out of principle, demonstrating through daily choices that happiness does not depend on material abundance. In all these practical recommendations, we detect Musonius's underlying conviction that philosophy must reshape the whole of life, not merely occupy a corner of intellectual interest. The philosopher is not someone who thinks about virtue for an hour each day while living the rest of their time according to conventional values. Rather, the philosopher brings philosophical principles to bear on every decision, every action, every moment. This totality of commitment distinguishes the genuine philosopher from the dilettante. Yet Musonius was not naive about the difficulty of this undertaking. He recognized that most people, even those initially attracted to philosophy, would not persevere in the demanding work of self-transformation. The path requires too much effort, demands too many sacrifices of comfort and convention. Students would come to him full of enthusiasm, drawn by the beauty of Stoic ideals, but many would drift away when they discovered that philosophy required more than intellectual appreciation. It required fundamental change in how they lived. For those who did persevere, however, Musonius promised something invaluable: genuine freedom. Not freedom in the political sense, not freedom to do whatever one pleases, but freedom in the philosophical sense. Freedom from enslavement to irrational desires. Freedom from fear of external circumstances. Freedom from dependence on others' opinions. Freedom from the tyranny of unexamined impulses. This freedom, the freedom of the well-ordered soul, represented for Musonius the highest human achievement. As we prepare to explore Musonius's teachings in greater depth, we might reflect on what drew us to this exploration. Perhaps we sense, as many Romans in the first century sensed, that mere material prosperity does not satisfy the deepest human longings. Perhaps we recognize in ourselves the gap between what we know we should do and what we actually do. Perhaps we yearn for a philosophy that offers not just ideas to contemplate but practices that can transform us. Musonius stands before us across the centuries as a witness to the possibility of such transformation. He showed that philosophy need not remain abstract, that its principles can be lived even under difficult circumstances, that the examined and practiced life offers a form of flourishing that external conditions cannot destroy. His student Epictetus would carry these teachings forward, and through Epictetus they would reach us today, still vital, still challenging, still offering a path toward wisdom and inner strength. In the parts that follow, we will walk this path with Musonius as our guide. We will explore his teachings on simplicity, on training, on facing hardship, on the relationship between philosophy and daily life. We will consider how his insights might apply to our own circumstances, so different in detail yet fundamentally similar in the challenges they present. We will discover that this forgotten master has much to teach us, that his emphasis on practice over theory speaks directly to our contemporary need for philosophy that transforms rather than merely informs. For now, let us simply acknowledge the figure of Musonius Rufus, standing in the shadows of history, pointing not to himself but toward the life well lived through philosophical practice. He asks nothing of us except that we take philosophy seriously, that we test its teachings through application, that we commit ourselves to the difficult but rewarding work of becoming who we truly are. To understand Musonius Rufus in his fullness, we must first understand the world into which he spoke. The Rome of the first century was not simply an empire of marble and military might. It was a world of profound contradictions, where immense wealth existed alongside desperate poverty, where philosophical schools flourished even as tyranny threatened free thought, where the cosmopolitan mixing of cultures created both opportunity and anxiety. Into this complex world, Musonius brought a voice that was at once traditional and radical. He belonged to the Stoic school, a philosophical tradition already centuries old by his time, yet he shaped it with his own distinctive emphasis. Where other philosophers of his era might gather students in lecture halls to parse the fine points of logic or cosmology, Musonius insisted that philosophy was not primarily an intellectual exercise. It was a training ground for the soul. The very title by which history remembers him, the Roman Socrates, tells us something essential about his method and his mission. Like Socrates before him, Musonius believed that the unexamined life was not worth living. Like Socrates, he engaged with people directly, personally, intimately. He did not merely transmit doctrines. He transformed lives through example and through pointed questions that forced his students to confront their own assumptions. Yet Musonius was no mere imitator of the ancient Athenian sage. He brought to Stoicism a particularly Roman sensibility, an emphasis on practical virtue and endurance that reflected the Roman character at its best. Where Greek philosophy could sometimes become lost in abstraction, Musonius anchored every discussion in the concrete realities of daily life. How should we eat? How should we dress? How should we train our bodies? How should we raise our children? These were not trivial questions for him. They were the very substance of philosophy itself. We know frustratingly little about Musonius compared to other ancient philosophers. Unlike Marcus Aurelius, we have no personal journal of his reflections. Unlike Seneca, we have no extensive letters offering detailed advice. Unlike Epictetus, his most famous student, we have no comprehensive collection of discourses preserved by a devoted follower. What we possess are fragments, scattered teachings preserved by various ancient writers, quotations and summaries that give us glimpses of a comprehensive philosophical vision. Yet even in fragments, the voice of Musonius comes through with remarkable clarity and power. We hear a teacher who is uncompromising in his commitment to virtue, yet compassionate in his understanding of human weakness. We encounter a thinker who insists on the highest standards while acknowledging the difficulty of meeting them. We find a man who believed that philosophy could genuinely transform not just individuals but entire societies, if only people would commit to living philosophically rather than merely thinking philosophically. His life spanned one of the most turbulent periods in Roman history. He witnessed the reign of Nero, that emperor whose name became synonymous with tyranny and excess. He experienced exile, that punishment reserved for those whose ideas threatened the established order. He knew hardship firsthand, not as an abstract concept to be discussed in comfortable classrooms, but as lived reality that tested every principle he taught. This biographical context matters immensely for understanding Musonius. He was not a philosopher who speculated about hardship from a position of safety and comfort. He was a man who had endured genuine suffering and emerged from it with his philosophical convictions not shaken but strengthened. When he taught his students to train themselves through voluntary hardship, to embrace difficulty as an opportunity for growth, he spoke from experience. His words carried the authority not just of logical argument but of lived truth. The relationship between teacher and student stands at the very heart of ancient philosophy. This was not education as we might conceive it today, where information is transferred efficiently from instructor to learner. It was something more intimate and more demanding. The philosophical teacher was not merely conveying content. He was shaping character, forming souls, creating exemplars of wisdom who would themselves become teachers. When Musonius took on students, he accepted a profound responsibility. He became, in a sense, responsible for who they would become, not just what they would know. The ancient philosophical schools understood something we have perhaps forgotten in our modern educational systems. They recognized that genuine learning, particularly in matters of ethics and the art of living, requires more than intellectual understanding. It requires transformation. Epictetus arrived in Musonius's circle as a slave. We must pause to appreciate the significance of this fact. In the hierarchical society of ancient Rome, the distance between slave and philosopher could hardly have been greater. Yet Musonius saw in this young slave something that transcended social status. He saw a soul capable of wisdom, a mind capable of grasping the deepest truths about human existence. And he taught him as he would teach any freeborn Roman student of good family. This tells us something essential about Musonius's understanding of philosophy and human nature. The Stoics taught that virtue was the only true good, and that it was equally available to all human beings regardless of their external circumstances. But many people teach doctrines they do not fully live. Musonius demonstrated his commitment to this principle through action. By accepting Epictetus as a serious student, by investing in his philosophical education with the same care he would offer anyone, Musonius embodied the Stoic conviction that what matters is the condition of the soul, not the accidents of birth or social position. What did the young Epictetus learn from his master? Certainly he learned the core teachings of Stoic philosophy, the distinction between what is up to us and what is not, the nature of good and evil, the importance of living in accordance with nature. But more than any specific doctrine, Epictetus absorbed from Musonius a particular way of approaching philosophy itself. He learned that philosophy is not a subject to be studied but a life to be lived. He learned that the measure of philosophical progress is not how many arguments you can construct or how many texts you can quote, but how you actually conduct yourself in the circumstances of your life. He learned that the philosopher's task is not to build elaborate theories about ethics, but to become ethical, to transform himself into a living embodiment of virtue. The intensity of this teacher-student relationship is difficult to convey in an age where education has become largely impersonal and instrumental. Musonius was not preparing Epictetus for a career. He was not credentialing him for professional advancement. He was initiating him into a way of life, welcoming him into a tradition of wisdom that stretched back centuries, and equipping him to continue that tradition into the future. The apprenticeship model of philosophical education created chains of transmission that gave ancient philosophy its continuity and power. Socrates taught Plato, who taught Aristotle. Zeno founded the Stoic school, which produced teachers who taught teachers across generations. Musonius stands in this lineage, receiving the Stoic tradition from his own teachers and passing it forward to Epictetus, who would in turn teach others and whose teachings would be recorded and preserved for posterity. But we must not imagine this transmission as merely mechanical, as if philosophical wisdom were simply poured from one vessel into another. Each great teacher received the tradition and made it their own, emphasized certain aspects, developed particular applications, spoke in their own distinctive voice. Musonius received Stoicism and gave it his particular stamp. Epictetus received it from Musonius and transformed it again, developing his own emphases and methods. This is how living traditions remain vital rather than becoming ossified. What was distinctive about Musonius's version of Stoicism? Above all, it was his unrelenting insistence on practice. For Musonius, the gap between knowing and doing was the fundamental problem of philosophy. It was not enough to understand intellectually that virtue is the only good. One must train oneself to actually desire only virtue, to be unmoved by external things. It was not enough to agree in principle that we should endure hardship. One must deliberately seek out hardship as a form of training. This emphasis on practice, on askesis, that Greek word meaning training or discipline, runs through everything we know of Musonius's teaching. He approached philosophy with the mindset of an athletic trainer. Just as the athlete must train the body through repeated exercises, gradually increasing strength and endurance, so the student of philosophy must train the soul. And just as physical training can be uncomfortable, even painful, so too philosophical training requires us to do things that may be difficult or unpleasant. Musonius advocated for what we might call voluntary hardship. He encouraged his students to deliberately choose simple food over luxurious fare, plain clothing over fine garments, hard beds over soft ones. This was not asceticism for its own sake, not some belief that comfort is inherently evil. Rather, it was training. By deliberately choosing the harder option when we could choose the easier one, we strengthen our capacity to endure involuntary hardship when it comes. Consider the wisdom of this approach. If we spend our lives pursuing comfort, surrounding ourselves with softness, avoiding every difficulty we can avoid. What happens when unavoidable hardship arrives? We find ourselves unprepared, weak, unable to cope. We have trained ourselves for ease, and life rarely offers sustained ease. But if we have trained ourselves through voluntary discipline, when involuntary hardship comes, we meet it with strength built through practice. This idea of training finds expression throughout Stoic philosophy, but Musonius gave it particular emphasis and practical specification. He did not simply say that philosophers should be prepared for hardship. He told them exactly how to prepare. Eat simple foods, sleep on hard beds, dress plainly, expose yourself to heat and cold, undertake physical labor. These were not arbitrary penances, but deliberate exercises designed to strengthen specific capacities. There is something deeply practical, almost engineering-like, in this approach. Musonius analyzed what qualities the philosophical life required and then designed training methods to develop those qualities. It requires the ability to be content with little, then practice living with little. It requires the ability to endure physical discomfort, then deliberately expose yourself to discomfort. It requires freedom from dependence on luxury, then forgo luxury until it loses its power over you. We might contrast this with a more purely intellectual approach to philosophy, one that focuses on reading texts, analyzing arguments, constructing theories. Such intellectual work has its place and its value. But Musonius recognized that when it comes to ethics, to the art of living well, intellectual understanding is only the beginning. The real work lies in transformation, in actually becoming the sort of person who embodies wisdom. This raises a profound question about the nature of philosophical knowledge itself. What does it mean to know something philosophically? If someone can articulate the principles of Stoic ethics perfectly, quote all the relevant texts, construct sophisticated arguments in defense of Stoic positions, but then lives in a way completely contrary to those principles, do they really know Stoic philosophy? Musonius would say no. Philosophical knowledge, for him, was inseparable from philosophical practice. This view has significant implications. It means that philosophy cannot be mastered through study alone. It means there are no shortcuts to wisdom. It means that someone who has read nothing but lives virtuously is philosophically superior to someone who has read everything but lives viciously. This may seem obvious when stated plainly, yet how often do we treat knowledge as if it were primarily a matter of information rather than transformation? Musonius taught that the person who truly understands philosophical truth will naturally act in accordance with it. If someone intellectually grasps that virtue is the only good but continues to pursue wealth and pleasure as if they were genuinely good, this reveals not true understanding but mere verbal facility. They have learned to say the right words without grasping the reality those words point toward. Imagine learning to swim. You could read every book ever written about swimming, study the physics of buoyancy and propulsion, watch countless videos of expert swimmers, memorize every technique. But until you actually get in the water and practice, you cannot swim. The knowledge remains abstract, disconnected from capability. Philosophy for Musonius is like this. Reading about virtue is not the same as becoming virtuous. Understanding arguments for simple living is not the same as actually living simply. This insight helps explain why Musonius placed such emphasis on the teacher-student relationship. A book can transmit information. A lecture can explain concepts. But the transformation of character requires something more. It requires the example of someone who embodies the philosophical life. It requires personal guidance from someone who can see your specific weaknesses and suggest appropriate exercises. It requires encouragement when the training becomes difficult, correction when you stray from the path. When Epictetus looked at Musonius, he saw not just someone who taught Stoic philosophy, but someone who lived it. He saw someone who had endured exile without losing his composure, who lived simply without complaint, who faced powerful and dangerous people without compromising his principles. This living example taught more powerfully than any words could teach. It showed that the philosophical life was not merely a beautiful theory but an achievable reality. This is why Musonius, despite having written works that have not survived, despite leaving behind only fragments and reports of his teaching, could nevertheless produce a student like Epictetus, whose influence on the Stoic tradition proved immense. What Epictetus absorbed from Musonius was not primarily a body of doctrines but a way of being, an approach to life, a commitment to philosophy as practice rather than mere theory. We see this emphasis on practice over theory throughout the teachings of Epictetus that have come down to us. Again and again, Epictetus returns to the theme that what matters is not what you say you believe but how you actually live. He criticizes students who want to discuss fine points of logic when they have not yet mastered the basics of ethical living. He insists that the true philosopher will be recognized not by their eloquence but by their character. These emphases clearly reflect the influence of his teacher. The transmission of wisdom from Musonius to Epictetus represents one of the great successes of ancient philosophical education. Here we have a slave who became a philosopher so influential that his teachings were studied by emperors. We have someone born into the lowest social position who, through philosophical training, developed a nobility of character that surpassed that of most freeborn Romans. This is the transformation that philosophy, properly practiced, can achieve. Yet we must be careful not to romanticize this relationship or this achievement. The training Musonius offered was demanding, often uncomfortable, sometimes harsh. Philosophical education in this tradition was not meant to be pleasant. It was meant to be effective. The teacher's role was not to make students feel good about themselves, but to help them become genuinely good. This sometimes required harsh truths, difficult exercises, unflinching confrontation with one's own failings. There is a story, possibly apocryphal but philosophically instructive, about Musonius and his students. When some of them complained about the austerity of the philosophical life he advocated, suggesting that such extreme simplicity was unreasonable, Musonius responded by living even more simply himself, demonstrating through his own example that what he taught was not theoretical ideal but practical reality. He did not argue with his students about whether simple living was possible. He showed them it was possible by doing it. This willingness to lead by example, to subject oneself to the same demands one places on students, is crucial to effective teaching of this kind. It establishes credibility. It demonstrates possibility. It removes the excuse that what is being taught is mere theory disconnected from practice. Musonius could call his students to endure hardship because he endured hardship. He could advocate for simple living because he lived simply. His life authenticated his teaching. We might reflect on how different this is from much modern education, where teachers and students often exist in separate spheres, where the teacher's personal life may have no connection to what they teach, where what matters is the ability to transmit information rather than to exemplify a way of life. There are, of course, different kinds of teaching appropriate to different kinds of knowledge. But for the kind of wisdom Musonius sought to impart, wisdom about how to live, how to face difficulty, how to develop character, the exemplary model remains uniquely powerful. The emphasis on practice that characterized Musonius's teaching should not be understood as anti-intellectual. He was not opposed to theoretical understanding. Rather, he insisted that theory and practice must be integrated, that understanding must be embodied, that knowledge must transform into wisdom. The goal was not to produce students who could debate, but students who could live well. This integrated approach addressed a problem that has plagued philosophy throughout its history: the gap between philosophical profession and philosophical life. There have always been those who speak beautifully about virtue while living viciously, who can construct elegant arguments for moderation while indulging every appetite. Musonius sought to close this gap, to make the philosophical life and the life of the philosopher identical. His method was to emphasize habituation. Just as we develop physical habits through repeated action, we develop character through repeated choices. If we want to become courageous, we must practice acting courageously in small matters until courage becomes habitual. If we want to become temperate, we must practice moderation until it becomes second nature. Virtue, for Musonius, was not an abstract quality but a set of well-developed habits that shape how we respond to circumstances. This understanding of virtue as habitual excellence has deep roots in Greek philosophy, going back at least to Aristotle. But Musonius gave it a distinctively Stoic application. For the Stoics, virtue meant living in accordance with nature, which meant acting rationally and appropriately in every situation. To develop this capacity required extensive training, making correct response habitual rather than laborious. Consider how we navigate most daily situations. We do not consciously deliberate about every action. Much of what we do flows from habit, from patterns of response we have developed over time. This is efficient and necessary. We could not function if we had to consciously decide every tiny action. But it also means that our habits shape our lives profoundly. If our habits are good, our lives will tend toward the good. If our habits are corrupt, our lives will tend toward corruption. Musonius understood this psychological reality and made it central to his pedagogical approach. He sought to help students develop good habits through practice. This meant not just studying what virtue requires, but repeatedly acting virtuously until virtuous action becomes automatic. It meant training oneself to respond to insult with equanimity, to face danger with courage, to encounter pleasure with moderation, until these responses become characteristic. The training regimen Musonius advocated was comprehensive. It addressed the body as well as the mind. This integration of physical and mental training distinguished his approach. Many philosophers treated the body as irrelevant to philosophical development or even as an obstacle to be overcome. Musonius saw the body as the instrument through which we act in the world, and therefore as something requiring proper training. He advocated for physical exercise and manual labor, not because he thought physical strength was intrinsically valuable, but because physical training developed qualities of endurance, discipline, and perseverance that transferred to moral development. Someone who has trained their body to endure discomfort has also trained their mind. Someone who has developed the discipline to maintain a regular practice of exercise has developed discipline that serves them in every area of life. There was also, in Musonius's emphasis on physical training and simple living, a rejection of the excessive refinement and luxury that characterized elite Roman society. He saw such luxury not merely as morally neutral indulgence, but as actively corrupting. When people surround themselves with constant comfort, they weaken themselves. They become dependent on external conditions for their well-being. They lose the resilience that makes it possible to face difficulty without being destroyed by it. This critique of luxury had both personal and political dimensions. On the personal level, luxury enslaves us to objects and circumstances, making our happiness dependent on things outside our control. The person who requires fine foods to be content is at the mercy of their supply. The person who has trained themselves to be content with simple food is free, able to maintain their equanimity regardless of what is available. On the political level, Musonius saw the luxury and decadence of Roman elite society as symptoms of moral decline that threatened the very foundations of Rome. The old Roman virtues, courage, discipline, simplicity, endurance, were being abandoned in favor of soft living and self-indulgence. This transformation did not merely affect individuals but threatened to weaken Rome itself. A society of soft, self-indulgent people could not maintain the strength and virtue required to sustain a great civilization. We can see in Musonius's teaching a conservative impulse, a desire to preserve traditional virtues against the corrupting influence of wealth and sophistication. Yet this conservatism was not mere nostalgia. It was rooted in a philosophical analysis of what human beings need to flourish. He believed that the simple, disciplined life was not just morally superior but actually more conducive to human happiness than the life of luxury and ease. This is a challenging claim, one that runs counter to many of our instincts and assumptions. Surely comfort is preferable to discomfort, pleasure to pain, ease to difficulty? Yet Musonius invited his students to test this assumption through experience. Try living simply for a time. See whether the constant pursuit of pleasure actually makes you happier or whether it leaves you always hungry for more. See whether training yourself to endure hardship makes you stronger or weaker. The genius of this experiential approach is that it bypasses purely theoretical debate. Someone can argue endlessly about whether simple living or luxurious living is better for human flourishing. But someone who has actually lived both ways, who has tried the philosophical life of simplicity and discipline, has direct knowledge. Musonius trusted that those who genuinely tried philosophical practice would discover its value through lived experience. This reflects a deep confidence in the truth of Stoic philosophy. Musonius did not think he was imposing arbitrary restrictions on his students. He believed he was teaching them to live in accordance with their own nature as rational beings, and that this way of life would prove through experience to be superior. The simple life was not a grim duty to be endured, but a liberation to be embraced. When we understand Musonius's emphasis on practice in this light, we see it not as harsh asceticism but as compassionate teaching. He was offering his students a path to genuine flourishing, to the kind of deep contentment that comes from living well rather than the shallow pleasure that comes from comfortable circumstances. He was teaching them to find happiness in what was up to them, their own character and choices, rather than in external things forever subject to chance. The relationship between Musonius and Epictetus exemplifies this teaching approach at its best. A teacher who embodied philosophical principles teaching a student who absorbed not just doctrines but a way of being. The result was that Epictetus himself became a teacher capable of transmitting the same wisdom to others. The chain continued, the tradition lived on, the transformation kept occurring. In Epictetus's teachings, we hear echoes of Musonius. When Epictetus emphasizes the distinction between what is up to us and what is not, we hear the practical wisdom of his teacher. When he insists that philosophy must be practiced daily, not just studied, we hear Musonius's voice. When he speaks of training oneself through voluntary hardship, we recognize the method he learned in his youth. The student honored his teacher by living and teaching the wisdom he had received. This chain of transmission, from teacher to student across generations, is how philosophical wisdom survives and renews itself. It is not primarily through books, though books help preserve teachings. It is through the living relationship between someone who embodies wisdom and someone who seeks it, between someone who has walked the path and someone who is beginning the journey. Musonius stood in this chain, receiving wisdom from his teachers and passing it to his students, keeping alive a tradition of practical philosophy that continues to speak to us across the centuries. We return now to a deeper consideration of what it meant, in Musonius Rufus's understanding, to live philosophically. For him, philosophy was never a matter of accumulating doctrines or mastering clever arguments. It was not a pursuit reserved for leisure hours or isolated contemplation. Philosophy, as Musonius taught it, was the very texture of daily existence, woven into every choice, every response, every moment of encounter with the world and with oneself. This vision of philosophy as life practice stands in marked contrast to certain tendencies that existed even in his own time. There were teachers who prized eloquence above all, who trained students in rhetoric so polished it could dazzle any audience. There were schools where subtle logical distinctions were endlessly debated, where philosophical questions became intellectual games played for their own sake. Musonius did not dismiss such skills entirely, but neither did he consider them the heart of philosophy. The heart of philosophy, for Musonius, beat in the rhythm of daily decisions. It pumped blood into the hands that worked, the feet that walked, the voice that spoke with neighbors, the mind that responded to insult or injury. Philosophy lived in the household and the marketplace, in the quiet of morning and the fatigue of evening. It lived wherever a human being faced the question of how to be, how to act, how to meet what life presented. This emphasis on lived philosophy created a particular atmosphere in Musonius's teaching. Students came to him not merely to learn what the Stoics believed, but to become different kinds of people. They came to transform their reflexes, to reshape their desires, to rebuild their understanding of what mattered. This was not quick work. It could not be accomplished through a few impressive lectures or a single season of study. Musonius understood that genuine philosophical transformation required something more like apprenticeship than classroom learning. A person learning carpentry does not simply hear about wood and tools. They handle the material, make mistakes, develop skill through repetition. Similarly, a person learning to live philosophically must practice the responses, endure the difficulties, return again and again to the basic exercises until new patterns become natural. This practical orientation shaped everything about how Musonius taught. When he spoke about virtue, he did not present it as an abstract ideal but as a capacity to be developed through specific training. When he discussed wisdom or courage or self-control, he directed attention toward the situations where these qualities would be tested and the methods by which they could be strengthened. consider how Musonius approached the virtue of self-control. He did not merely praise it or explain its philosophical importance. He gave concrete guidance about how to train it. He spoke about food and drink, about sleep and comfort, about sexual desire and material possessions. He recognized that these were the domains where most people's self-control would be tested daily, and therefore where philosophical practice must focus. His teaching about food, for instance, was remarkably practical. He recommended a simple diet, primarily of foods requiring little preparation, foods close to their natural state. This was not asceticism for its own sake, nor was it a moral judgment about pleasure. It was training. By choosing plain food, a person practiced governing appetite rather than being governed by it. By eating simply, one reduced dependence on complex circumstances and maintained the capacity to be content with what was readily available. The same practical logic extended to every area of life. Musonius taught that housing should be adequate for protection and health but not elaborate. Clothing should be functional rather than fashionable. Furnishings should serve use rather than display. In each case, the recommendations served philosophical development. Simplicity in external things created freedom from anxiety about them, reduced vulnerability to fortune, and directed energy toward what genuinely mattered. This practical emphasis in Musonius's teaching reveals something important about Stoic philosophy more broadly. The Stoics are sometimes portrayed as focused primarily on mental discipline, on achieving the right thoughts and judgments. While the Stoics certainly valued correct judgment as foundational, teachers like Musonius recognized that judgment and behavior deeply influence each other. A person cannot maintain philosophical understanding while living in patterns that contradict it. Nor can mere intellectual agreement with Stoic principles substitute for the character formed through practice. Musonius saw clearly that habits shape the soul. If someone habitually seeks luxury, judges worth by possessions, and organizes life around comfort, their actual understanding of value becomes distorted regardless of what philosophical propositions they claim to accept. The daily practice judgment that expensive things are desirable eventually overwrites the abstract belief that virtue alone is good. Conversely, someone who practices simple living, who trains in self-sufficiency, who regularly chooses function over display, gradually develops a soul that genuinely experiences these truths rather than merely affirming them. This is why Musonius insisted that philosophy must be trained like any other skill. You cannot become a musician by reading about music theory, however thoroughly. You cannot become a physician by memorizing medical texts, however carefully. You must practice, repeatedly, correcting mistakes, developing sensitivity and judgment through engagement with actual cases. Philosophy, Musonius taught, is no different. To become wise requires practicing wisdom, attempting it, failing sometimes, improving gradually through sustained effort. The comparison to physical training particularly illuminated Musonius's approach. Just as an athlete develops strength and endurance through progressive challenge to the body, a philosopher develops virtue through progressive challenge to character. This meant deliberately choosing difficult circumstances sometimes, not pursuing hardship for its own sake but recognizing that certain capacities grow only under resistance. When Musonius was exiled, he maintained that this hardship offered opportunity for philosophical development. Exile tested patience, resourcefulness, and equanimity. It revealed which supports one truly needed and which were merely habitual comforts. It created conditions where philosophy's practical value became evident. A person with genuine self-sufficiency discovered they could live well even in reduced circumstances. A person dependent on luxury and status for contentment discovered how fragile their happiness truly was. This does not mean Musonius celebrated suffering or taught that hardship was intrinsically good. The Stoics understood hardship as a dispreferred indifferent, something not inherently valuable but potentially useful for developing virtue. The ideal life would include health, security, and adequate resources. But since life inevitably includes difficulties regardless of our preferences, wisdom requires learning to meet those difficulties well, and even to extract value from them. This perspective allowed Musonius to approach his own exile with remarkable equanimity. He did not pretend exile was pleasant or desirable. He acknowledged its genuine difficulties, but he refused to treat it as catastrophic, as fundamentally incompatible with living well. Instead, he explored how to live philosophically within these constraints, how to maintain dignity and purpose despite external limitations. The accounts we have suggest that Musonius lived in exile much as he had lived in Rome, continuing to teach anyone willing to learn, maintaining his philosophical practices, meeting circumstances with the same measured response he advocated to students. This consistency between teaching and living gave his words particular weight. Students could observe that his philosophy actually sustained him through genuine difficulty, that it was not merely theoretical speculation but lived wisdom. Among the practical teachings Musonius offered, his approach to hardship training deserves special attention. He taught that a person serious about philosophy should deliberately practice endurance and self-denial, not constantly but regularly, as part of ongoing development. This might involve sleeping on a hard bed periodically, going without certain comforts, fasting, enduring cold or heat, engaging in physically demanding work, or undertaking tasks that challenged one's patience and resilience. Modern readers might find such recommendations strange or unnecessarily severe. We live in a culture that generally treats comfort as unambiguously good, that regards any voluntary discomfort with suspicion. Why would someone deliberately make life harder for themselves? What possible benefit could come from choosing difficulty when ease is available? Musonius's answer would begin with a question in return. What happens to someone who has never practiced endurance when life inevitably demands it? What resources does a person have for meeting serious difficulty if they have spent years avoiding every minor discomfort? The person who has trained in hardship has developed capacities the perpetually comfortable person lacks. When genuine trouble arrives, as it eventually does for everyone, the trained person has practiced meeting challenge, has discovered their own resilience, has learned they can bear what must be borne. Beyond this preparatory function, hardship training served a diagnostic purpose. It revealed where one's philosophy was genuine and where it remained merely theoretical. A person might believe they had achieved detachment from luxury, but a period of deliberate simplicity would quickly show whether this was true. They might think themselves patient and even-tempered, but a frustrating task would reveal their actual tolerance. Regular practice in hardship created opportunities to discover where one's character needed further development. There was also what we might call a calibrating function to such training. Most people, most of the time, exist within a fairly narrow range of circumstances. We sleep in the same bed, eat similar food, follow familiar routines, experience a generally consistent level of comfort. Within this constancy, small variations feel large. A slightly uncomfortable chair seems unbearable. A modest delay feels intolerable. We lose perspective on what genuinely merits concern. Someone who periodically practices endurance maintains a wider frame of reference. Having experienced genuine discomfort deliberately, they recognize that most daily inconveniences are truly minor. Having voluntarily gone without certain comforts, they appreciate them more when present but need them less for contentment. Having practiced patience in difficult circumstances, they find ordinary frustrations less disturbing. The range of conditions they can meet with equanimity expands. Musonius was careful to distinguish this kind of training from pointless self-punishment. The purpose was not to suffer but to develop capacity. Just as an athlete's training involves discomfort but aims at excellence rather than pain, philosophical hardship training involved difficulty but aimed at virtue. The discomfort was instrumental, a means toward becoming someone who could live well under various conditions, not an end in itself. This distinction matters because Stoicism is sometimes caricatured as promoting grim endurance, as teaching people to tolerate miserable circumstances without complaint. But Musonius's approach was not about resigning oneself to misery. It was about developing such robust character that one's well-being remained stable across changing circumstances. It was about building genuine self-sufficiency, the kind that allowed a person to remain content and purposeful whether fortune smiled or frowned. The training Musonius advocated was also explicitly progressive and individualized. He did not prescribe the same regimen for everyone or suggest that extreme practices were necessary. Rather, he encouraged each person to identify areas where their character needed strengthening and to practice appropriately challenging exercises in those areas. Someone prone to anger might practice patience in frustrating situations. Someone dependent on luxury might practice simplicity. Someone physically soft might engage in demanding labor. The relationship between teacher and student in Musonius's approach deserves deeper consideration. In his view, the philosophical teacher served a function quite different from the lecturer who merely conveys information. The teacher was more like a physician treating disease, more like a trainer developing an athlete, more like a craftsman guiding an apprentice. The relationship required trust, commitment, and sustained engagement from both parties. Musonius understood that philosophical teaching often involved discomfort for the student. Just as a physician must sometimes prescribe bitter medicine or a trainer must push an athlete beyond their comfort zone, a philosopher must sometimes challenge a student's cherished beliefs or comfortable patterns. This could not be done effectively without genuine care for the student's development, and without trust that the teacher's challenges served their growth rather than the teacher's ego. This is part of what made Musonius's own character so important to his teaching effectiveness. Students needed to observe that he lived according to the principles he taught, that his recommendations emerged from genuine wisdom rather than theoretical speculation. They needed to see that his challenges to their assumptions came from concern for their flourishing, not from any pleasure in contradiction or dominance. The accounts we have of Musonius suggest he combined high standards with evident goodwill. He did not flatter students or tell them what they wished to hear. He directly addressed failures of understanding or character. Yet students apparently experienced this confrontation as beneficial rather than merely critical. They sensed that he saw their potential and challenged them toward it rather than simply finding fault. This combination is rare and valuable. Many teachers can be warm but ineffective, never pushing students beyond comfortable understanding. Others can be demanding but harsh, creating anxiety rather than growth. Musonius seems to have achieved something more difficult, a teaching presence that was simultaneously challenging and supportive, demanding and encouraging, critical and compassionate. Consider how this might have worked in practice. Imagine a student who came from a wealthy family, accustomed to luxury and status, beginning to study with Musonius. The student might have arrived with philosophical interests, but also with deeply ingrained assumptions about what made life good. Assumptions reflected in habits of expensive tastes and concern for reputation. Musonius would not have immediately attacked these assumptions or demanded dramatic changes. Rather, through questions and observations, he would have helped the student notice contradictions between their professed philosophical commitments and their actual priorities. He would have invited the student to experiment with simpler living, to practice occasional self-denial, to observe their own responses when comfortable patterns were disrupted. As the student engaged these practices, Musonius would have been present to discuss what they discovered, to help interpret their experiences philosophically, to encourage progress and correct misunderstanding. When the student struggled or resisted, Musonius would have neither given up on them nor forced compliance, but rather worked to understand what made the teaching difficult and how to help them move forward. This process required time and patience from both teacher and student. Philosophical transformation is not quick. Habits of thought and behavior established over years do not change through a single insight or decision. They change through sustained practice, repeated attempts, gradual progress punctuated by setbacks and recommitments. Musonius's teaching therefore involved ongoing relationship rather than isolated instruction. Students did not simply attend a lecture series and graduate. They lived near their teacher, observed his daily life, engaged in regular conversations, attempted practices and reported results, received guidance adjusted to their specific struggles and circumstances. The teaching relationship became a context for growth over months and years. This model of philosophical education has largely disappeared from our world. We expect education to be efficient, compressed into courses and credentials. We want to learn philosophy by reading books or attending lectures, absorbing content we can then apply independently. There is value in such learning, certainly, but it differs significantly from the formation Musonius offered. The formation Musonius provided was more akin to what happened in craft guilds, where an apprentice worked alongside a master for years, gradually developing skill and judgment that could not be conveyed through instruction alone. Or it resembled athletic coaching, where an experienced trainer observed a developing athlete carefully, providing specific feedback and progressive challenges calibrated to current capacity and ultimate potential. This kind of education required certain conditions we might find difficult to recreate. It required that students and teachers lived in proximity, that students had time to dedicate to formation rather than merely information gathering, that the relationship could unfold over extended periods. It required that philosophical education be recognized as serious, demanding work rather than casual intellectual interest. Yet even if we cannot fully recreate those conditions, we can learn from what made Musonius's teaching effective. We can recognize that philosophical development requires more than intellectual understanding. We can seek to practice what we learn rather than merely accumulating beliefs. We can identify teachers or texts or communities that support sustained engagement with philosophical transformation rather than just dispensing information. We can also recognize the importance of philosophy as embodied in a person rather than just articulated in words. Musonius mattered as a teacher not only because of what he said but because of who he was, how he lived, what his presence demonstrated about philosophical life. Students learned from his composure in difficulty, from his simplicity in daily matters, from his steady focus on what actually mattered. This points toward a dimension of philosophical teaching that we might otherwise overlook. We often think of teaching as primarily a matter of clear explanation, of making complex ideas accessible. Certainly clarity matters, but philosophical teaching involves something beyond explanation. It involves modeling, demonstration, the living proof that philosophy works, that it enables human flourishing even under challenging conditions. When Musonius spoke about enduring hardship philosophically, his words carried weight because he had done so. When he taught about simplicity, students could observe his simple lifestyle. When he discussed self-control, they could see it practiced in his daily choices. The teaching was not simply transmitted through words but demonstrated through a life. This is part of what creates genuine philosophical lineage, the transmission of wisdom from teacher to student across generations. Epictetus learned from Musonius not just Stoic doctrines but a way of being Stoic, an approach to philosophical life that he then developed further and transmitted to his own students. This living transmission differs from merely studying texts, however valuable that study may be. When we read Epictetus, we encounter not just ideas but a voice shaped by years of study with Musonius. We hear emphases Musonius planted, concerns he cultivated, practices he modeled. We encounter philosophy as lived tradition rather than abstract system. This gives the teaching a quality of authenticity and depth it might otherwise lack. Yet even in this living tradition, we notice important developments and variations. Epictetus taught differently than Musonius, emphasized different aspects of Stoicism, developed the teaching in new directions. The tradition was alive precisely because it adapted and grew rather than merely repeating. Each teacher brought their own experience and insight to the philosophy they had received, making it genuinely their own while remaining faithful to its essential wisdom. This suggests something important about how we might engage with Stoic philosophy today. We cannot simply reproduce ancient practices unchanged. Our circumstances differ too significantly, but we can engage the essential wisdom those practices embodied, asking how to live philosophically within our own context. We can practice the underlying principles rather than merely imitating surface forms. This requires a certain creativity and discernment. We must understand the philosophy deeply enough to recognize what is essential and what is culturally specific. We must experiment with practices, observing what genuinely serves our development and what merely replicates external forms without inner substance. We must be willing to adapt while maintaining fidelity to the core insights. Musonius's emphasis on the universality of philosophical capacity provides another crucial dimension of his teaching. Unlike some ancient philosophers who thought serious philosophical study was appropriate only for certain people or social classes, Musonius insisted that philosophy was for everyone, that the capacity for virtue and wisdom existed universally across human beings regardless of their circumstances. This conviction led him to welcome students from various backgrounds. While many came from privileged families, as was common for philosophical students, Musonius did not restrict his teaching to the wealthy or highborn. He taught women as well as men, remarkable for his time and culture. He taught slaves as well as free citizens. He recognized philosophical potential wherever it existed, and he insisted that virtue was equally possible for all. This universalism had important implications. If philosophy was for everyone, then it could not require resources or circumstances available only to a few. It could not depend on extensive leisure, elaborate education, or freedom from practical responsibilities. It had to be livable within ordinary life, compatible with work and family obligations, accessible to people of modest means and limited formal learning. This requirement reinforced Musonius's practical orientation. Philosophy had to be simple enough to practice while making a living, raising children, managing a household, meeting daily responsibilities. It had to strengthen people for life's actual demands rather than requiring retreat from those demands. It had to be, in the fullest sense, a way of living rather than a specialized intellectual pursuit. Musonius's teaching about women's philosophical capacity deserves particular attention. In a culture that generally denied women access to advanced education and questioned their intellectual capabilities, Musonius argued that women had the same natural capacity for virtue as men and should receive the same philosophical training. He reasoned that since virtue was what made human life good, and since women were human beings, women both needed and could achieve virtue through proper training. His arguments were practical rather than abstract. He pointed out that women needed courage, wisdom, justice, and self-control just as men did. A woman needed courage to face dangers threatening her household, wisdom to manage resources well, justice in her dealings with others, self-control in her desires and reactions. Why then should she not receive training in these virtues? Why should she be denied the education that would enable her to fulfill her responsibilities excellently? Musonius further argued that philosophical training would make women better wives and mothers, better household managers, better members of their communities. This argument, while still reflecting assumptions about women's roles that we might question, was remarkably progressive for his time. It insisted that women's minds should be cultivated, that they were capable of genuine understanding and wisdom, that their development mattered. The presence of women students in Musonius's teaching circle suggests he practiced what he taught. While we do not have extensive records of specific women students, the evidence indicates he welcomed them and taught them seriously. This openness created a more inclusive philosophical community than was typical and modeled the universalism his philosophy proclaimed. Similarly, Musonius's attitude towards slaves reflected his conviction that philosophical capacity transcended social status. The clearest example, of course, was his student Epictetus, who came to him as a slave. Musonius apparently recognized Epictetus's exceptional philosophical potential immediately, accepting him as a serious student despite his enslaved status. This relationship reveals something important about Musonius's character and teaching. He did not simply tolerate Epictetus as a slave who happened to be interested in philosophy. He took him seriously as a philosophical student, devoted time and attention to his development, and treated him with the respect due to someone engaged in the highest human pursuit. The teacher-student relationship in Musonius's practice transcended conventional social hierarchies. This does not mean Musonius actively worked to abolish slavery as an institution. The Stoics, despite their philosophical commitments to human equality in terms of rational capacity and virtue potential, generally accepted slavery as a social reality of their time. This acceptance represents a troubling limitation in their philosophy, a failure to draw the full implications of their own principles. Yet even within this limitation, Musonius's treatment of Epictetus and his teaching about universal philosophical capacity pointed toward a more egalitarian understanding of human worth. By insisting that virtue was equally available to all, regardless of social status, he undermined the ultimate significance of social hierarchies. If what made life good was virtue, and if virtue was equally achievable by slave and emperor, then the external markers of status that ancient society took so seriously had no fundamental importance. This philosophical position created an inner freedom that external circumstances could not touch. An enslaved person who achieved virtue was, in the deepest sense, free, while a political ruler who lacked virtue remained enslaved to passions and false judgments. This reversal of conventional values did not change social realities, but it provided resources for maintaining dignity and purpose within those realities. Epictetus himself would develop this theme powerfully in his own teaching. Having been enslaved himself, he spoke with authority about maintaining inner freedom regardless of external constraint. He emphasized that what ultimately mattered was always within one's control, one's own will and judgment, which no master could truly command. This teaching clearly reflected what he learned from Musonius, developed through his own experience and insight. The teacher-student lineage from Musonius to Epictetus represents one of the most significant transmissions in Stoic philosophy. Through Epictetus and through Marcus Aurelius, who studied Epictetus's teachings, Musonius's emphasis on practical philosophy reached across centuries. The particular flavor of Stoicism we encounter in Epictetus and Marcus, its intense focus on lived practice and daily application, owes much to Musonius's influence. This lineage reminds us that philosophy is not just a set of ideas, but a living practice passed from person to person, shaped by individual experiences and insights, growing and developing as each generation engages it authentically. Musonius learned from earlier Stoics and developed the teaching in new directions. Epictetus learned from Musonius and contributed his own emphases and insights. Marcus learned from Epictetus and applied Stoicism to the unique challenges of ruling an empire. Each brought something new while remaining faithful to the tradition's core. Each made Stoicism their own while honoring what they had received. This is how living philosophical traditions work, how ancient wisdom remains relevant and vital rather than becoming merely historical curiosity. For those of us engaging Stoicism today, this lineage offers both inspiration and guidance. We are not the first to find wisdom in these teachings, nor the first to work out how to practice them in daily life. We stand in a tradition extending back more than 2 millennia, a tradition shaped by real people meeting real challenges with philosophical practice. We can draw on this tradition while also contributing to it, bringing our own experiences and insights to bear on timeless questions. We face different specific circumstances than ancient Stoics, but we face the same fundamental human challenges. How to live well, how to meet difficulty with dignity, how to find meaning and purpose, how to maintain equanimity amid changing fortune. The practical emphasis Musonius championed remains as relevant now as in his own time. We still need to train ourselves in virtue, still need to practice what we profess to believe, still need to build character through sustained effort. We still face the temptation to substitute intellectual understanding for genuine transformation, still need reminders that philosophy must be lived to be real. As we move forward in our exploration of Musonius's teaching, we carry with us this understanding of philosophy as practice, as training, as way of life. We recognize that engaging his wisdom means more than learning what he taught. It means attempting to practice what he practiced, to develop the capacities he developed, to live with the same commitment to philosophical transformation that characterized his life. We have traveled far in our exploration of Musonius Rufus, tracing the contours of his teaching, examining the foundations of his philosophy, and witnessing the living legacy he passed to Epictetus and through him to all subsequent generations. We have considered his principles, reflected on his uncommon wisdom, and observed how deeply he believed that philosophy must be enacted, not merely contemplated. Now we turn to what may be the most essential dimension of all, the practical application of these teachings in the texture of daily life. For Musonius believed, as we have seen, that philosophy without application is merely noise. Words spoken but not embodied. Principles affirmed but never tested. He would have little patience with us if we stopped at understanding. He would ask, with characteristic directness, what we intend to do, how we intend to live, what specific practices we will undertake to align our actions with our professed values. This is not about perfection. Musonius did not expect anyone to wake tomorrow as a sage. He understood human nature too well for such naivety. But he did expect movement. He expected effort. He expected the genuine attempt to translate insight into conduct, to make what we know shape how we live. Let us begin with perhaps the most accessible entry point into Musonius's practical philosophy, the practice of simplicity in material life. This is not asceticism for its own sake, not self-punishment disguised as virtue. Rather, it is the deliberate cultivation of independence from external circumstances. It is training in what later Stoics would call autarkia, self-sufficiency, the capacity to live well regardless of what fortune provides or withholds. Consider your own relationship with possessions. Not in abstract terms, but concretely. Walk through your living space and observe what fills it. How many of these things do you genuinely need? How many serve a real purpose in your life? And how many are simply accumulated weight, objects acquired through habit or impulse, things you neither use nor particularly value? Musonius would encourage you to simplify. Not dramatically, perhaps not all at once, but genuinely. Begin with a single room, a single category of belongings. Notice what you can release without loss. Notice how space itself, emptied of clutter, can become a form of clarity. This practice is not about deprivation. It is about discernment. It is about learning to distinguish between what adds value to your life and what merely adds complication. Every object you own makes a small claim on your attention. It must be stored, maintained, perhaps worried over. Simplicity is the practice of reducing these claims, of creating room in both your physical space and your mental space for what truly matters. In practical terms, this might mean adopting a simple rule. Before acquiring anything new, consider whether it will genuinely serve your life or merely satisfy a momentary impulse. Musonius would approve of such a practice. He might even make it more stringent, asking you to give away one thing for every new thing acquired. The specific rule matters less than the underlying intention. To live with deliberateness, to make choices rather than drift into accumulation. Consider also your dwelling itself. Musonius taught that philosophy can be practiced equally well in modest surroundings as in luxurious ones, but that modest surroundings have certain advantages. They do not distract. They do not require elaborate maintenance. They do not create the anxiety that comes with protecting valuable things from loss or damage. This does not mean you must live in poverty or discomfort. Musonius was not advocating suffering as a virtue. Rather, he was pointing toward sufficiency, toward the recognition that a simple, well-ordered dwelling provides everything truly necessary for a good life. Warmth, shelter, a place to rest, a place to think. What more does philosophy require? If your circumstances allow you comfort, receive it gratefully but without attachment. If they require simplicity, accept it without resentment. The Stoic aim is not to control whether you live simply or comfortably, but to remain internally free regardless of which condition obtains. The practice of voluntary simplicity trains this freedom. It shows you that you can live well with less, and this knowledge becomes a profound source of security. Turn now to the practice of food and drink, another area where Musonius offered concrete guidance. He advocated plain, simple meals not because pleasure is wrong, but because dependence on elaborate pleasures makes us vulnerable. The person who can only enjoy complicated, expensive food has limited themselves. They have made their contentment conditional on circumstances they cannot control. Musonius would suggest eating simply, at least sometimes, as a deliberate practice. Not to punish yourself, but to train your capacity for satisfaction. To discover that a simple meal, eaten with gratitude and attention, can be deeply satisfying. Bread, vegetables, water. These sustained Musonius. These sustained countless philosophers who lived fully, thought deeply, and taught powerfully. In your own life, this might translate into a simple practice. One day each week, eat only plain, unadorned food. Notice your reactions. Do you feel deprived? Bored? Resistant? These reactions are informative. They show you where you have become dependent on stimulation, where you have confused genuine need with acquired preference. Or approach it differently. In your normal eating, practice attention. Eat slowly. Notice flavors, textures, the actual experience of nourishment. Often we eat while distracted, barely tasting our food, consuming it while our minds are elsewhere. This is not simplicity but unconsciousness. Musonius would advocate presence. Being fully there for the simple act of eating, finding satisfaction in the experience itself rather than in its elaborateness. Regarding physical training, Musonius was emphatic and practical. The body must be strengthened not for its own sake, not for appearance or athletic achievement, but because philosophy requires a serviceable instrument. A weak body limits what you can do, makes you more dependent on others, leaves you vulnerable to circumstances that a stronger person could navigate with ease. The practice here is straightforward. Regular physical exercise appropriate to your capacity. This need not be complex. Walking serves well. Simple body weight exercises. Manual labor if your circumstances involve it. The goal is not impressive performance but basic capability and resilience. Musonius particularly valued exercises that combined physical exertion with practical utility. Work that strengthens while accomplishing something useful. There is wisdom in this. When exercise is integrated into productive activity, It loses any quality of vanity or self-absorption. You are not exercising to improve yourself as a display object, but maintaining your capacity to be useful, to contribute, to remain independent. Consider what practices might work in your own context. Perhaps you can walk rather than drive for short distances. Perhaps you can take stairs rather than elevators. Perhaps you can engage in some form of physical work around your home, maintenance or repair or cultivation that keeps your body capable while serving practical needs. The key is regularity and appropriateness, not heroic efforts that cannot be sustained, but modest practices maintained consistently. Musonius was not training athletes. He was training philosophers who needed bodies capable of supporting their work, resilient enough to endure difficulty when it came. Alongside physical training, Musonius emphasized training in endurance and discomfort. This might seem strange to modern sensibilities, but his reasoning was clear. Life inevitably contains hardship. If you have never practiced enduring difficulty, you will be overwhelmed when it arrives uninvited. But if you have deliberately exposed yourself to manageable discomfort, you will have developed the capacity to bear larger difficulties with equanimity. In practical terms, this ancient practice can be adapted to contemporary life. You might periodically practice going without something you normally rely on. Not dangerously, not in ways that harm you, but in ways that reveal your dependencies and build your resilience. Perhaps you practice occasional cold exposure, taking a cold shower when you would prefer warmth. Not to suffer, but to discover that you can be uncomfortable and remain fundamentally well. Perhaps you occasionally fast for a day, experiencing hunger while recognizing that it is merely sensation, not emergency. Perhaps you practice enduring minor inconveniences without complaint, without the impulse to immediately fix or escape every uncomfortable situation. These practices build what Musonius considered essential: the capacity to remain internally steady when external circumstances become difficult. And external circumstances will become difficult. This is not pessimism but realism. Loss comes, illness comes, disappointment and grief and frustration come. If you have never practiced bearing lesser difficulties, you have no foundation for bearing greater ones. But if you have trained yourself, if you have discovered through practice that you are more resilient than you assumed, then when genuine hardship arrives, you will meet it not as catastrophe but as difficulty to be endured. This is freedom of a profound kind. Not freedom from suffering, which is impossible, but freedom within suffering, which is achievable. Consider also Musonius's teaching on speech and conversation. Here too there are concrete practices available. Musonius advocated speaking only when necessary, and then only truthfully and usefully. This is remarkably challenging. Most of us speak far more than necessary, filling silence with chatter, offering opinions no one requested, speaking before we have thought. The practice: before speaking, pause. Ask yourself whether what you intend to say is true, whether it is kind, whether it is necessary. If it fails any of these tests, consider remaining silent. This is not about suppressing yourself or becoming cold and withdrawn. It is about developing deliberateness in speech, about ensuring that your words serve communication rather than merely releasing nervous energy or seeking attention. You will find this difficult. We all do. The impulse to speak arises constantly, and often it arises from ego rather than genuine need to communicate. But the practice of pausing before speaking gradually develops a capacity for consideration. You begin to notice the space between impulse and action. You begin to choose your words rather than simply emit them. Related to this is the practice of accepting correction without defensiveness. Musonius taught that we should welcome feedback, seeing it not as attack but as assistance. Someone who points out our error is helping us, not harming us. They are offering us information we can use to improve. The practice: when someone corrects you or criticizes you, pause before responding. Resist the immediate impulse to defend, explain, or counterattack. Instead, consider whether there is truth in what they are saying. Even if their delivery is harsh or their motivation questionable, might they be pointing to something real? This practice is profoundly liberating. Most of us spend enormous energy defending ourselves, protecting our self-image, maintaining the fiction that we are already as we should be. This is exhausting and futile. The person who can accept correction without defensiveness has dropped a tremendous burden. They can learn from anyone. They can improve continuously. They are not trapped in the prison of needing to be right. Musonius also taught the importance of choosing companions wisely, and here again there is practical application. You cannot always control who you encounter, but you can often influence who you spend sustained time with. The practice is to gradually orient yourself toward people who support your effort to live philosophically. This does not mean surrounding yourself with people who agree with everything you say. That would be useless. Rather, it means seeking relationships with people who are themselves trying to live with integrity, who value truth, who can both challenge and support your development. It means being willing to distance yourself from relationships that consistently undermine your better intentions. In practical terms, this might mean declining certain invitations. It might mean limiting time with people whose influence on you is consistently negative. It might mean seeking out communities, even informal ones, where philosophical values are practiced. Book groups, discussion circles, or simply friendship with individuals who share your orientation toward living thoughtfully. This is not about superiority or judgment. It is about recognizing that we are influenced by those we spend time with, and that we can make wise choices about these influences. Musonius understood that philosophy is difficult enough without constantly swimming against the current of our social environment. Choose, when you can, to place yourself in currents that flow in directions you want to travel. Consider now the practice of gratitude, which, though not unique to Musonius, was certainly consistent with his teaching. The practice is simple but transformative. Regularly acknowledge what you have rather than lamenting what you lack. This is not positive thinking or self-deception. It is accurate perception. In practical terms, you might establish a daily practice of noting 3 things you are grateful for. Not grand things necessarily. Simple things. Warm water, a comfortable chair, the ability to read. These are not trivial. They are remarkable privileges that most humans throughout history did not enjoy. Recognizing them is seeing clearly. Or practice this more informally, simply noticing throughout your day what is working, what is given, what you receive without earning it. The sun rises without your effort. Your body breathes while you sleep. People you have never met grew the food you eat. When you look clearly, existence is revealed as an overwhelming gift, and most of what we complain about is revealed as remarkably minor. This practice does not deny real suffering or real problems, but it provides context. It prevents you from living in perpetual dissatisfaction, always focused on what is wrong or lacking. Musonius, teaching his students to be satisfied with simple food and plain clothes, was teaching this, that sufficiency is available now, that contentment need not wait for circumstances to improve. Regarding work, Musonius taught that honest labor of any kind is honorable if performed with integrity. The practice here is to approach whatever work you do, whether grand or humble, as an opportunity for philosophical practice. You can perform any task with attention and care. You can treat any role as a location for virtue. If you wash dishes, wash them with full presence, doing the task well for its own sake. If you answer correspondence, do so thoughtfully, with respect for those you address. If you perform complex professional work, do so with integrity, refusing compromises that would corrupt your character regardless of what career advantages they might provide. This transforms work from mere necessity into practice field. Suddenly, every task becomes an opportunity to develop virtue, to practice attention, to align action with principle. No work is too humble for this. Musonius himself performed manual labor during his exile, seeing it not as degradation but as philosophy practiced through different means. The practice of premeditation, valued by Stoics generally and certainly consistent with Musonius's approach, offers another concrete application. Before entering any situation, particularly one that might be challenging, mentally rehearse possible difficulties, not to create anxiety, but to prepare yourself. If you must have a difficult conversation, consider beforehand how it might unfold. If you face a demanding situation, imagine complications that might arise. Then consider how you wish to respond. What principles will guide you? What reactions will you avoid? This mental rehearsal does not guarantee perfect execution, but it shifts you from reactive to prepared. It gives you a chance to respond from your values rather than from immediate impulse. Similarly, the evening review that Epictetus learned from Musonius remains valuable. At day's end, briefly review your actions. Where did you act consistently with your principles? Where did you fall short? What can you learn? This is not self-punishment but honest assessment, the way an athlete reviews their training to identify what needs attention. The practice need not be elaborate. A few minutes of honest reflection. What did I do well today? Where did I respond with virtue? Where did I react from ego or fear? What will I do differently tomorrow? This sustained practice gradually aligns your behavior with your intentions, bringing action and principle into increasing harmony. In relationships, Musonius's teaching suggests specific practices. Treat others with fairness and respect regardless of their status. Practice seeing the human being before you rather than the category you place them in. When wronged, pause before retaliating, considering whether responding with anger will improve anything or merely perpetuate harm. This is perhaps one of the most challenging practices, responding to injury without immediate retaliation. Musonius knew this was difficult. That is precisely why he taught it. The capacity to remain calm when provoked, to respond thoughtfully rather than reactively, is freedom. It means you are not controlled by others' actions. They cannot make you abandon your principles simply by treating you badly. All of these practices share a common foundation. They move philosophy from abstract principle to concrete action. They translate understanding into conduct. They make wisdom something you do, not merely something you know. This was Musonius's constant emphasis, his enduring contribution. Philosophy must be lived. Begin modestly. Choose one or two practices that resonate with your current situation and capacity. Perhaps simplifying your possessions. Perhaps pausing before speaking. Perhaps introducing regular physical exercise. Perhaps practicing gratitude. Start where you are with what you can actually do. Practice consistently but without rigidity. If you miss a day, simply resume. If a practice proves inappropriate for your circumstances, adapt it or choose differently. The goal is not perfect adherence to a program but gradual transformation of how you live. Musonius would care little about whether you followed his specific recommendations exactly. He would care greatly about whether you are genuinely practicing philosophy in whatever forms prove workable for you. As these practices establish themselves, you will notice changes. Not dramatic, perhaps, not sudden, but real. You will find yourself slightly less reactive, slightly more present, slightly less dependent on external circumstances for your internal state. These small shifts accumulate. Over time, they constitute transformation. This is the path Musonius taught. Not transcendence, not escape from ordinary existence into philosophical otherworld. Rather, the gradual cultivation of virtue within the texture of daily life, making your actual life with all its demands and limitations into philosophical practice. This is how wisdom becomes real. This is how understanding becomes character. We have walked a long road together through these hours, tracing the life and teachings of a philosopher who chose the difficult path of lived wisdom. Musonius Rufus stands before us now not merely as a historical figure from distant Rome, but as a presence that asks something of us. His philosophy was never meant to remain in scrolls or lectures. It was meant to enter the body, the daily routine, the small choices that accumulate into a life. As we begin to gather what we have explored, we might notice how his teachings form not a system to be memorized, but a way of being to be practiced. The emphasis on simplicity, the insistence on hardship as training, the conviction that philosophy belongs equally to all people regardless of gender or station. These are not separate doctrines but facets of a single vision. Musonius saw human life as it actually unfolds, with its necessities and limitations, and he asked how we might live well within those conditions. The question of how to live well is ancient, yet it meets us freshly each morning. We wake to a world that offers countless paths, endless opinions about what matters, infinite ways to spend our brief time. In such a world, the clarity of Musonius speaks across the centuries. He did not promise ease or comfort. He did not suggest that wisdom could be purchased or quickly acquired. Instead, he pointed toward the elementary truth that we become what we practice, that our character is forged through repeated action, that the good life requires training as surely as any physical skill. When we consider his teaching that women should study philosophy as thoroughly as men, we encounter more than an early argument for equality. We find a philosopher who understood that wisdom concerns the whole of human life, not just the portion traditionally reserved for elite males. The household, the preparation of food, the raising of children, the management of daily needs. All of this was philosophical territory for Musonius. He refused to separate the so-called higher pursuits from the elementary activities that sustain existence. In this refusal, he showed a rare integrity. The same integrity appears in his teaching about food. Where others might have written treatises on virtue in abstract terms, Musonius pointed to the dinner table. What we eat, how much, with what attitude, these reveal our relationship to desire, to self-control, to the natural world that sustains us. A simple meal, eaten with gratitude and moderation, becomes a philosophical practice. The one who can be satisfied with bread and water has achieved a freedom that no luxury can provide. This is the practical genius of Musonius. He brought philosophy into the kitchen, the bedroom, the fields. He insisted that the person who cannot govern their appetite for food is unlikely to govern their appetite for wealth or power or fame. The small disciplines prepare us for the larger ones. The daily practices build the character that will meet the great tests when they arrive. And those tests will arrive. Musonius knew this not from theory but from experience. He faced exile twice, was banned from Rome, saw his fellow philosophers silenced or killed. Yet he did not become bitter or cynical. He continued to teach, to practice, to demonstrate that inner freedom could not be touched by external circumstance. His exiles became opportunities to practice what he taught. The hardships he endured were the very training he recommended to his students. When we look at the relationship between Musonius and his most famous student, Epictetus, we see how wisdom transmits itself. Epictetus arrived as a slave, perhaps broken in body but not in spirit. What did he find in Musonius? Not pity, not abstract theory, but a rigorous training in seeing clearly. Musonius taught him that no one could enslave his mind, that his capacity for judgment remained his own, that he could practice philosophy regardless of his external condition. This transmission of wisdom represents something essential about the Stoic tradition. It passes not primarily through books or formal institutions, but through the relationship between teacher and student, through living example, through the daily demonstration of principles in action. Epictetus learned philosophy not by reading about it, but by watching Musonius live it, by being held to the same standards, by discovering through practice that the teachings worked. And when Epictetus later taught his own students, he carried forward not just the ideas of Musonius but his approach. The emphasis on practice over theory, the use of blunt and direct language, the insistence that philosophy must change how we live. All of this echoes from teacher to student across generations. We find in the discourses of Epictetus the voice of Musonius speaking through him, adapted and expressed in a new situation but fundamentally unchanged in its core message. This is how genuine teaching works. It does not merely transmit information but transforms the person. Musonius did not fill Epictetus with facts about Stoic doctrine. He trained him to think differently, to respond differently, to stand in the world differently. The change was so thorough that Epictetus could later teach others with authority, could face his own challenges with equanimity, could demonstrate through his own life what he had learned. What then have we learned as we have sat with these teachings through these hours? Perhaps the most important lesson is the simplest, that philosophy is something we do, not something we merely think about. Musonius would have little patience with the person who can recite Stoic principles but lives in contradiction to them. He would be unimpressed by sophisticated arguments divorced from action. He would ask instead, what have you practiced today? How have you trained yourself? In what small way have you exercised virtue? These questions remain immediate and pressing. We might know that we should not be governed by our desires, yet we find ourselves scrolling endlessly, eating thoughtlessly, spending compulsively. We might agree that external things should not disturb our inner peace, yet we find ourselves anxious about circumstances beyond our control. We might believe in living simply, yet our homes fill with things we do not need and barely use. The gap between knowing and doing is the space where philosophy must work. Musonius understood this gap intimately. He saw that human beings are creatures of habit, that we become what we repeatedly do, that change requires not just new ideas but new patterns of action reinforced over time. This is why he emphasized training, why he recommended deliberate hardship, why he insisted that philosophy must be practiced as consistently as an athlete trains or a musician rehearses. The training he recommended was not arbitrary or punitive. It served a clear purpose: to build our capacity to live well under any circumstance. When we voluntarily practice discomfort, sleeping on a hard bed, eating simple food, exposing ourselves to cold or heat, we are not punishing ourselves. We are discovering that we can endure more than we thought, that our well-being does not depend on continuous comfort, that we have inner resources we had not tapped. This discovery is liberating. The person who knows they can be content with little is not at the mercy of circumstance. They can face uncertainty without panic, can lose possessions without losing peace of mind, can meet hardship without feeling that life has become unbearable. The training builds resilience not by making us hard or indifferent, but by showing us that our happiness has a more stable foundation than we imagined. That foundation, in Musonius's teaching, is virtue itself. This is the heart of Stoic philosophy, the claim that our true good lies not in external things but in the quality of our character, the integrity of our choices, the wisdom of our judgments. Everything else, health, wealth, reputation, even life itself, these are what the Stoics called preferred indifference. We naturally prefer them to their opposites, but they are not ultimately what makes a life good or bad. This claim challenges us deeply. Our entire world seems organized around the pursuit of external goods. We work for money, seek recognition, guard our health, try to secure comfort and security. Are we to dismiss all of this as meaningless? Not at all. Musonius lived in the world, managed a household, cared for his physical needs. But he maintained a clear understanding of what these things were. Preferred but not essential, useful but not ultimate, to be pursued reasonably but not at the cost of virtue. The person who grasps this distinction gains a remarkable freedom. They can engage fully with life, can work and plan and pursue goals, but without the desperate attachment that makes us fragile. They can lose what they have without losing themselves. They can face death without terror, because they have not placed their ultimate good in something that death can take away. Yet this is not an easy teaching to embody. It asks us to swim against the current of our culture, our conditioning, perhaps even our evolutionary inheritance. We are built to care about survival, to pursue comfort, to fear loss. Musonius does not ask us to deny these tendencies, but to bring them under rational governance. We can prefer comfort while being able to endure discomfort. We can love our dear ones while understanding that we do not control how long we have them. We can work for prosperity while knowing that our peace of mind does not depend on achieving it. This balanced engagement with life requires continuous practice. We do not achieve it once and then possess it permanently. Each day presents new situations, new challenges to our equanimity, new opportunities to choose virtue over convenience. The training never ends because life never stops testing us. But this is not a burden. It is the very texture of human existence. We are always in the process of becoming, always practicing, always learning. Musonius would remind us that this process unfolds in the details of daily life. Philosophy happens not in some separate sphere, but in how we speak to our family members, how we respond to frustration, how we handle disappointment, how we treat those who have less power than we do. Every interaction is an opportunity to practice wisdom, justice, courage, or moderation. Every moment offers a choice about who we are becoming. This is why he placed such emphasis on practice and training. He knew that when the moment of choice arrives, we will act according to our habits. If we have practiced responding to insult with equanimity, we will likely do so when insulted. If we have trained ourselves to pause before reacting in anger, we will find that pause available to us. If we have repeatedly chosen simplicity, we will be less vulnerable to the lure of luxury. The person we are in the crisis is the person we have been becoming through countless small choices. Consider how this applies to our contemporary context. We live in a time of extraordinary comfort for many, yet also of extraordinary anxiety. We have more material abundance than any previous generation, yet we struggle with dissatisfaction, restlessness, a sense that something essential is missing. Perhaps what is missing is precisely what Musonius taught: a clear understanding of what matters, regular training in virtue, the satisfaction that comes from living according to our principles rather than our impulses. The simplicity he advocated is not poverty or deprivation. It is freedom from the burden of maintaining appearances, from the anxiety of protecting possessions, from the exhausting pursuit of more and more. The simple life, in his understanding, is actually richer because it focuses energy and attention on what genuinely nourishes us. Good relationships, meaningful work, learning, service, the development of character. Many of us already sense this truth. We feel the weight of our possessions, the distraction of our entertainments, the emptiness of status seeking. We have moments when we see clearly that we have confused means with ends, that we have sacrificed what matters for what merely glitters. Yet we find it difficult to change course. The momentum of our lives, the expectations of others, our own habits, all of this keeps us on a path we are not sure we chose. Musonius offers not judgment but a method. We need not overturn our entire life in a day. We can begin with small practices, eating more simply at one meal, speaking with greater honesty in one conversation, examining one desire before indulging it. These small practices accumulate. They train our capacity for self-governance. They begin to shift the center of gravity of our lives from external things to inner character. The shift is subtle at first. We might notice that we are less disturbed by a minor inconvenience, less desperate for a particular outcome, more able to be present with what is actually happening rather than lost in worry about what might happen. These small changes are the seeds of transformation. Given time and consistent practice, they grow into a different way of being in the world. This different way of being is what Musonius embodied and what he passed to Epictetus, who passed it to his students, who passed it through writings and teachings down through the centuries until it reaches us here, now, in this moment. The chain of wisdom is not broken. The teachings remain available. The practices still work. What is required is simply that we take them up, that we begin where we are, that we practice today. As these hours conclude, we need not feel that we have reached some endpoint. The exploration of philosophy, as Musonius understood it, has no endpoint. There is always further to go, always deeper to understand, always more fully to embody what we know. This is not frustrating but hopeful. It means we always have something to work toward, always have a way to grow, always have the opportunity to practice wisdom. The teachings we have explored together, simplicity, self-sufficiency, training through hardship, the equality of all people in their capacity for wisdom, the primacy of practice over theory, these are not burdens to carry but tools to use. They are meant to make life easier in the deepest sense. Not by removing challenges, but by changing our relationship to them. They offer a way to be at home in the world regardless of external circumstances. Perhaps the greatest gift of Musonius is his confidence in our capacity. He did not teach that philosophy was only for the brilliant or the privileged. He insisted that every human being, regardless of gender or station, had the capacity for wisdom. This was not empty flattery but a recognition of what humans actually are, rational beings capable of self-governance, of learning, of virtue. He saw this capacity even in the slave who came to him for teaching, and he was proven right when that slave became one of the most influential philosophers in the Stoic tradition. The same capacity exists in us. We may doubt it, may feel inadequate to the task, may think that wisdom belongs to others but not to us. Yet the teaching and the practice remain available. We can begin simply, can take one small step toward living more deliberately, more virtuously, more freely. That step leads to another, and gradually we find that we are walking a path we did not know we could walk. As you move from these hours of reflection back into the stream of daily life, carry with you not a heavy burden of new rules, but a light reminder of what matters. You need not be perfect. You need not transform overnight. You need only to practice, to pay attention, to choose with growing awareness. The training of philosophy is gentle even when it is rigorous. It meets us where we are and invites us forward. The Roman Socrates, as Musonius was called, lived his philosophy so thoroughly that it survived his exile, outlasted his empire, and speaks to us still. His words have the weight of lived experience behind them. He knew hardship and did not break. He knew luxury and did not mistake it for happiness. He knew what mattered and devoted his life to it. And now the teaching rests with you, with all of us who have listened and considered. The wisdom is not locked in the past. It is here, present, waiting to be practiced. May we meet our lives with the clarity and courage that Musonius embodied. May we train ourselves with patience. May we find freedom in simplicity, strength in discipline, and peace in virtue. The philosophy continues in the living of it, in each small choice, in the quiet cultivation of a good life.